Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of our special series, Active Measures. We started this a couple weeks ago because, as you recall, Tulsi Gabbard came out with this very preposterous thing, effectively saying, put my glasses on, effectively saying that there was absolutely nothing real about Russian interference in the 2016 election, that this was all made up by Obama and by Comey and by the CIA and so on and so forth, and there was nothing to see here. Well, Olga and I said that's complete bullshit, and we're not going to put up with it. So we are going to start a series, which we have, laying out in minute detail exactly how Russia not only interfered in the 2016 election, but effectively helped install Donald Trump in the White House the first time. And when we did that, that was just Tulsi Gabbard talking about stuff. But then Olga, yesterday, news broke that it's not just talk, that Pam Bondi, the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, let me stress again, not Donald Trump's personal lawyer, but the woman who works for us all, or at least on paper, that is what the Attorney General historically has always done. And in previous administrations, including others, when the president has interfered, the Attorney General either said no or has walked out or has been forced to resign. In this administration, not so much, which is why yesterday Pam Bondi said that she's convening a grand jury to indict people for what they call the Russia hoax and what we call the very real reality of what Russia did in the 2016 election. And we don't call it that. It is just that. It is a fact. And there's no amount of spin, Olga, and there's no amount of bullshit that is going to deter from what happened, which is that, as they have in previous iterations of the Russian country, what is the Soviet Union and other places, they interfered. So last week, Olga, we talked about the Soviet years and how the Soviet Union used all sorts of different measures, active measures, on people that they called useful idiots. I can't figure out whether Pam Bondi is a useful idiot or whether she's in on it and just doesn't care. But this time we want to talk about what happened in 2008 through 2012, effectively in the first Obama term, where Russia really began to treat the United States as an enemy to infiltrate, as an enemy to subvert, as an enemy to overthrow, which is, if you listen to Russian media, they talk about doing all the time, exactly the same rhetoric they used in the Soviet era. They're using it again. So good to see you, Olga. We're going to keep this one short because we have our usual Thursday live that we do to talk about more broad and global stuff to do with Russia. But this one is really about that 4-year cycle, 2008 to 2012, the first Obama administration, and what was going on. Olga, I want to talk to you about what happened when Barack Obama got elected, both here in the United States and also how the Russians perceived it and what they did. So tell me your thoughts on this.
So, for those who have not checked out the first installment, it's very important to read it just because it shows that this is a tactic that the KGB used. It's part of their playbook. Race wars, implosion of countries, subversion of democracies, religious wars. I mean, this is something, that they've done historically. So then to fast forward to 2008, by then, we have to go back. Putin basically consolidated power. He spent the first few years installing his loyalists, pretty much what Trump is doing now, into key agencies and state companies and private companies. And then he, made sure that he has full control. Once he had this, he decided to start moving outward. And this we cover before even 2008 hits. We touched on how Ukraine was a testing ground for these hybrid attacks, for election interference, for disinformation, and the whole information war that Russia runs against the West. we saw this in 2003, 4, when Russia was actively interfering in Ukraine, which led to the Orange Revolution. I mean, they took it up a step, up a notch by even poisoning the candidate who was the pro-European candidate, Yushchenko. By 2007, which we cover in this latest installment, Russia decided to basically attack Estonia. It started with a Soviet statue. I don't blame Estonians. They don't want a Soviet statue standing in the middle of their, city. So they decided to relocate it to the memorial on the outskirts of the city. By the way, another tactic we're seeing here, this, reinstallment of the Confederate statues. It's always about statues. And that sparked off such anger with Russia that not only did they mobilize the minority Russian speaking population, but they fed them with this disinformation and basically ran this polarization and everything what we've seen in the United States. And on top of it, they attacked Estonia with a massive cyber attack that lasted a few weeks, taking out their government agencies, federal institutions, and whatnot. So Russia got a test there. Again, how to use disinformation, how would a NATO country react to this? They saw there was no reaction. I mean, Estonia took care of themselves, NATO was MIA, and that's it. And here they again perfected interference. And then they moved on to 2008 with their attack on Georgia. Now, the attack on Georgia happened right as in the summer of 2008, right as the Bush administration was wrapping up on its way out. Obama made a mistake by not responding to it. Europe carried on as business as usual, as if, invading and annexing parts of a country which had not been done on since World War II was normal. And Russia there again ran their not only kinetic war, but their non-kinetic model. Saw there's no response to it, and they turned towards the U.S. Now, in the U.S., Obama was running. He won. They saw the burning of effigies and this, race war percolating. That for them, this was like a gold mine because this is part of the KGB playbook. And they got to work. The minute they saw this division, because this is how Russia operates, they see any small division and they will do everything to amplify it. So the
And and
minute
and and I
they,
and I just want to also stress, Olga, that in 2008 and 2009, really when Obama was inaugurated, that was really the rise of Twitter in the sense that social media became much more of a public square. Much
Mhm.
Facebook still then um, was effectively a much more closed ecosystem in that you really were just trading information with your friends and your cohort, as opposed to Twitter, which became a global town square, and became much more adaptable in 2009, which is exactly when the Russians went to work.
Yep, and someone asked, no, GRU has always existed in the Soviet Union and after it maintained its military
Yep.
intelligence. The KGB split after the collapse of the Soviet Union and basically changed letters, and it became SVR for foreign intelligence. SVR is responsible for United States, Canada, Western Europe, pretty much everything that is not in Russia's old sphere. The FSB counterintelligence is responsible and carries out operations more on the Baltics, Ukraine, Moldova. So they carry that. And the GRU, they carry out very distinct operations, which are poisonings, assassinations across Europe, um, sabotage operations, but they also are mainly concentrated and focused on Africa and Middle East operations. So that's where they fall in. So the KGB is basically the SVR and FSB. Interestingly enough, a lot of the old KGB people fell under some fell under SVR units and were carrying operations against Europe and US. Others fell under FSB and were carrying operations against Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and that part. Um, yes, the social media was a very important aspect. And at the same time, Russia used its literal KGB playbook. I mean, they saw this division percolating here. FBI, was issuing warnings because you saw more and more of this hate-filled attack and racist attacks happening across campuses and through the country. And this is when they got to work and they were like, oh, this is the perfect opportunity to basically, pour fuel on the fire in US because that's what Russia does. Sometimes they actually, um, concoct operations and carry it out. Other times they latch on to operations, as we've seen in COVID, and other times where, they see something happening and they jump in. So that happened in 2008, and then immediately they started sending their, agents to US to basically approach groups that were not happy with Obama. And this included evangelicals that they've actually had a long relationship with. But it included, building stronger ties with the evangelical community. It included getting into the NRA community and basically,
We're talking
really,
about that next week. But
yep,
yeah, I want to stay in the evangelicals for a second because I think it's important. So I personally don't think Vladimir Putin is this. Well, if you look at his personal life, you'd understand how not evangelical he really is.
yeah,
But he did something that the Soviets never did because they were much more ideological than he is. He, I don't believe, is ideological whatsoever. Um, he decided to co-opt the Russian Orthodox Church and effectively bring it as an arm into the Kremlin. And you do not have to this day any separation between church and state in Russia today. The patriarch is a wholly owned subsidiary. I mean, the stuff that he says about Ukraine today is insane and absurd, and certainly not anything that you would ever imagine the Pope, for example, saying. The Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, not being
yes,
abroad, but
to
in
Chris.
Russia,
Sorry.
yeah,
Yes,
yes,
to Chris. She
yes,
is.
yes. Um, they are very much a arm of the Russian government, and specifically of Vladimir Putin. And so all of this stuff that you hear about them banning LGBTQ issues in Russia, you know, do I think Vladimir Putin cares whatsoever if somebody's gay? Not in the least. Do I think
Yeah.
it's a great asset to be able to be the leader of the so-called reactionary forces worldwide? Absolutely. And that's what the evangelicals here, including Billy Graham's son, don't get, which is that all of these evangelicals who sit around praising Putin as this manly man and, all of this nonsense about him, wrestling with bears, bare chested, or whatever the hell he was doing, all of that is to play them and to get in with them and to co opt them. It is yet another useful idiot type operation where they're his useful idiots. And they are very, very, very useful idiots to him. Because when you have an entire evangelical movement that is dedicated effectively to the Republican Party, finding more common cause with a man who murders people for sport in a country that has been historically the enemy of this country than they did with Obama, who also made a big, big mistake. So I will say this as somebody who obviously has worked in politics my whole life. When Obama said that people are clinging to their guns and their religion, if you recall, he said that right before the 2008 election. That was a huge unforced error. But what's incredible to me is how much that played into the hands of the Russians and how much that played into the hands of the Russians co-opting the evangelicals to say, you see, this guy's not for you, but I, Vladimir Putin, I'm for you. It wasn't said that overtly, obviously, but that's also where you had a huge distinction between a president who was elected by the vast majority of this country. Remember, Obama won big. This wasn't a little Trump victory. I mean, he won big. It was an electoral college landslide, and he won big. Um, he very much played into their hands, I think, in terms of how they were then able to insidiously, through cutouts and through others, co-opt this very core component of the Republican Party. At the same time, the Tea Party was ascendant, and that was, you and I talked about this, Olga, that was really a Koch brothers project more than anything else. But the Russians were able to infiltrate themselves into the evangelical movement, which, of course, is such a large part of um, not just the Republican Party, but also, if you remember, helped the rise of Donald Trump. Because I had a conversation, I don't know if I ever told you this, speaking of 2016, in early 2016, I had a conversation with Robert Jeffries, who is, for people who don't know, probably one of the biggest evangelical pastors, if not the biggest evangelical pastor, has a mega church in Texas, just a huge, huge guy. And he and I were sitting in the green room, and it was right before the Iowa caucuses, and the only people who were really left, you know, were maybe I was after the Iowa caucuses. The only people left standing were Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. And I said to him, and I legitimately wanted to ask him the question. And when you hang out in green rooms and TV studios, you have honest conversations with people a lot. And I said, could I ask you a question? Because I'm not evangelical. I'm not even Christian. I have a question for you. And my question is, why would you support Donald Trump, who's been divorced 3 times and has, lived his life like a really gross guy by all accounts, over Ted Cruz, who's not my cup of tea, but certainly speaks your game a lot better than Donald Trump does, and plays your game a lot better than Donald Trump does, and has only had one wife, and all the reasons. And Jeffries turned to me and he said something that I thought was very interesting, very chilling, and very telling, which is he said, because Trump is going to win. And I say that now, and I raise this now because you brought up the evangelicals, Olga, and they were convinced that Trump was going to win, but Trump was going to win because they were supporting him, right? Like if they all teamed up against him, I'm not so sure that Trump would have won. But you had all of these evangelicals falling in line, and the question to me is why? And I wouldn't be surprised if they were played like a fiddle by the Russians, if the Russians were not whispering in their ear through not directly, and maybe directly with some.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again, treating them like the useful idiots that they were, to do it. And for those who said that they knew that he could get their agenda met with him, Cruz would have done the same thing. Cruz would have appointed the same people to the Supreme Court to repeal Roe versus Wade. Cruz, I mean, there's no question that Ted Cruz would have gone to the same Federalist Society lawyers and gotten the same pro-life judges. And, it's not that Trump was going to enact their agenda any more than Ted Cruz is going to enact their agenda. But they were convinced that Trump was going to win at a time when it was not at all clear to me that Trump was going to win.
That's
Um,
crazy.
yeah. And so I raise that now because I think it's critical for people to understand how much these people were co-opted. And they were co-opted in large part also, not just by Trump, who met with them, and that's great, whatever, but also by the Russians. Very much so.
So let me just add a few points to the evangelical community and just in general religion. One, um, Russian security services literally has a whole operation, depending what part again, if it's Western Europe, or United States or Canada, SVR is handling it, FSB for more local, and it's for Western traditional values. And they have a whole operation on this. I actually worked on an operation on an SVR nest targeting Europe, Germany, France. I mean, literally was included pretty much every country using the Orthodox Church and using this traditional values. And what happened is that this was established as there was more protections and freedoms for the LGBTQ plus community, and Russia seeing a wedge in this, you know, decided that this is another good avenue to pursue. So that's one. The Orthodox Church is extremely key. It's an arm of Russian intelligence. Interestingly enough, after the full scale invasion, I wrote an article for CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, where I'm a senior fellow, about the Russian Orthodox Church and how it literally is an arm of Russian intelligence. It has been an arm, how they actually run SVR our operatives out of their churches. And not only that, they run also GRU operatives, as in Serbia and others. That was the one thing that U.S. law enforcement was not looking at because it's religion and it's very difficult, to approach this. They wrote this article, and my article was taken off of Google. Not by Google and not by SIPA, but by Russia. Uh, The SIPO put back the article. The article again disappeared because Russia, this is the one last operation that no one has touched. The patriarch is a former KGB guy. Well, he served in the 70s as KGB. His, job was collecting information and, basically infiltrating Western churches. The prior patriarch, Alexei, KGB in the 70s and 60s. Same exact thing. Finally, European, he called the Baltics, several countries, Estonia and a few other countries finally designated the Russian Orthodox Church as the national security threat because of the fact that they use the church for espionage operations, for these polarizing operations inside countries, for recruitment and whatnot. Here, our Orthodox Church, we have a few that are conveniently planted by U.S. military bases and conveniently have an intersection with militia. So this just shows you what the Orthodox Church operation is. And, this was a this is pretty much a primary target of theirs, which we'll talk about next week, NRA, kind of percolated after. But this traditional value path was very, very something that they really, really have focused and cultivated and brought leaders from various, Europe, US, Canada, and have really done everything. Malofeyev, his right hand guy, runs the World Congress or whatever.
Explain who Malafeyev is.
So Malofeyev is the oligarch, what is it called? The Orthodox oligarch king. He funds he call it operations, and this is just actually a very perfect example of how the Orthodox Church operates. So he funds the Orthodox Church movement, very religious, quote unquote, and whatnot. He was sanctioned in 2014, I believe, by the United States for organizing the annexation of Crimea. So here, not only did they use the Orthodox Church as cover, they also worked very closely with the mercenaries, with Prigozhin's mercenaries, Wagner. They also work very closely with Putin's biker gang. What is it? Not Black Knights. Oh, oh, it'll come to me. So here you see how their Orthodox Church is, a whole operation, not only to indoctrinate people, but at the same time also to carry out violent annexations. And in my article for SEPA, I had written, or maybe another one that I had written for them about this, after the full scale invasion, the Russian Orthodox Church actually worked on putting together their own mercenary group to go fight in Ukraine under the flag of the Russian Orthodox Church. I was like, my God, we're going back to the 1500s where we're going to see now, arm of a church literally going to massacre people. And then, of course, not to mention all the other, their blessing of missiles before they go and everything else that they do. So the evangelical community and frankly, all religious communities have been very critical for Russia because this has been a huge divide across the world as LGBTQ plus community has gotten more rights. And the reason where with Obama, because he supported the LGBTQ plus community, he supported their freedoms, and this is where they saw a rift and where they could insert themselves into traditional values. And just one more thing, there was another operative, Charles Bowsman, who was being funded. He grew up in Russia. His father was a Soviet AP reporter during the Soviet Union. He grew up there. He came here specifically after annexation, set up this shit rag, Russia Insider. Um, and how you call it? At first, it was purposed to whitewash what they did with the invasion in Ukraine. By 2015, it shifted over to U.S. politics. Anyway, fast forward later, during he organized like a mini insurrection operation in Pennsylvania, went to the insurrection in the capital, and then fled back to Moscow. And this was just one of Malofeev's guys. So that
Yeah,
just shows you.
I also want to briefly touch on the rise of their overt propaganda in the form of Russia Today. If you remember Russia Today until it got kicked out of here when Biden became president, but in 2009, right around the time that Obama was inaugurated, Russia Today set up RT America. And it was, I remember it well. It was I'm sure most of you do too. It was a Russian, it was an English language media company that was funded entirely by the Russian government. Um, and it was supposed to be, we were led to believe, like the BBC or like, any of these other foreign media companies that come here and set up shop, like no big deal. Except that this one was entirely Russian propaganda. And they did something very interesting. They hired people from both the right and the left because the point here was not to particularly have any kind of ideological thread run through their programming. It was to sow division. And they constantly talked about divisive topics. They would take protest and inflate them to look like people were rioting and people were, on the verge of civil war in this country. They would hire people like Ed Schultz. I don't know if folks remember him from MSNBC. He was a very liberal commentator at MSNBC. He went to work for them. They hired a bunch of my old colleagues from Fox News, typically people who had gotten let go from Fox. They would pick up. And they would I remember calling me all the time to come on their network, which was hilarious because I would rather, you know, eat poison. But they would try to get as many people who they knew were trusted figures on television to come and be on their shows. And they would do this nonstop. And they would have their anchors try to reach out to people they had previously worked with to get them to come on nonstop to vouch for Russia Today. Well, Russia Today was a propaganda arm. And if you remember the big Mike Flynn debacle is when he and Jill Stein went to Russia and went to the Russia Today dinner. And Flynn, I think, was paid $50,000 for that. and sat next to Putin. And it was to try to get as many people as possible to uh, rent, who were establishment figures here, to lend credence to their propaganda. It got to be so vast that they were one of the top 5 news, and I use that word loosely, networks on YouTube. They had 2 billion views on YouTube by the time they were shut down by 2016. They were incredibly prolific, and they were an early adapter to Facebook, to Twitter. I mean, they really understood social media in ways that, frankly, CNN and others here domestically took them a very long time to catch up to. So there were so many different ways that they try to soften us up through overt propaganda, through inadvertent propaganda, through infiltrating different groups. And the reason we're not talking about the NRA today is because it requires an entirely separate post next week, which we're going to do. By having this illegals program, although that you maybe should talk about really briefly, to really infiltrate American culture and society, not government too. I mean, they had people within government to do this in think tanks, but also talk about the illegals program, because people who like The Americans, the show The Americans, that was such a big hit a few years ago, that's not fiction. That was based on real life. So why don't you talk about that quickly, if you don't mind?
So the Soviets had a very interesting and very hard to penetrate and understand program, basically the illegals. And what they did was that they pulled their agents. These agents went through extensive training. These weren't regular agents who were just sent abroad. They went through extensive training to basically take the identities of whatever target country it is. They were paired together normally, sometimes assigned children to pose as the family, whatever it is that the operation, you know, that they needed them for eventually in the future. And I mean, they really, it was such an extensive program, and still there's not as much um, information on it, except to what was taken out of the Soviet Union, and eventually defectors who, brought documents to show about this program. And to the point though, it was so extensive that they literally, like, if you're coming to America, they would train you
Oh, I mean,
to
it would
speak
be like,
perfect English, perfect, like no deviation from the English language, no accent. Like you were really, really trained, whatever. And then you were thrown into, say, an American neighborhood. And that's it. And you were there to assimilate and live and whatever until one day you get your assignment. So here in 2000, I believe, what was it, 11 or 10, we had Operation Ghost Stories that started in the 90s. And the FBI finally unraveled this ring. They were monitoring it, for quite a while, wanted to see who was part of this ring. Anna Chapman was one of it. Everyone, I believe, should have heard of Anna Chapman. She came here to pose as a real estate person in Manhattan and, like, socialite and whatnot. They all received new identities, obviously, even to the point that in this program that you would get surgery to change how your face looks, so to alter your appearance, sharpen your appearance, whatever your job was. They would basically reconstruct a whole life
but
around it,
but I just wanna,
including your face.
yeah, it wasn't so much even, I mean, in addition to the fact that they all learned perfect English and no accents, I mean, it was an education as in, like, tell me quickly, who was Sandy Koufax and what were his pitching stats, right? Like, things that were so
Yes.
endemic to this country that you'd have to know baseball, you'd have to know the rules of American football, you'd have to, I mean, really almost be
How to
immersed.
how to bake American pie, apple
Yeah, how to
pie.
bake an American pie. P.S. I would fail this test in a heartbeat because I don't know any of this stuff. But they would almost be taken as children or young adults and immersed in this. And the question is, were POWs from Vietnam sent to Russia and forced to coach these people were defectors sent, Kim Philby and that whole crew, in the 60s who were part of the Cambridge Five. Were they forced to go to not forced, they defected to Russia? Did they spend time training these kinds of people to infiltrate British society? I mean, this continuously happened so that they would then be able to live next door to you and me, and you'd never know the difference. And
Yeah.
I always laugh whenever people would watch The Americans. They think this is such a great show, and this is wow. Can you believe this is all happening? It was based on reality. That show was created after Operation Ghost Stories was exposed, and it was based on news articles that those producers and those writers had read about Operation Ghost Stories. So understand how truth is stranger than fiction. And if you want to know who Anna Chapman is, look her up. And not just Anna Chapman. She's the more famous one because she was very pretty and she was kind of the socialite. But there were people like Mr. and Mrs. I forgot their last name. It was pretty much Mr. and Mrs. Smith, practically, who
Pretty
were
much.
who were living in suburban New Jersey, I believe, or somewhere. Um, and
They're
yeah,
sleepers. They
yeah.
are sleepers. That's part of it, but they legal with a more extensive program, only because of that. And at the same time, they were, tasked with literally collecting all information, on everything in US, um, just to see as they're simulating to see what is happening, how people are, where are their divisions, where do we have loopholes, vulnerabilities, things like that. Interestingly, with Anna Chapman, I was told by a source years ago that, which we'll get into next week, Maria Butina, who was sent here, that after Anna Chapman was exchanged in a spy swap, that she was the one who prepared Butina to come here and basically gave her pointers on what to do. Obviously, now it's not as much because America has changed. So now you have, people from all around the globe, like everywhere. But in the 60s and 70s, if you are like an American bloc, like you had to have the perfect accent, like you couldn't look like you're out of place. So, but they still run these operations. There was a wild operation, I believe Sweden or Norway or Sweden, where they found a pair of illegals, husband and wife. I mean, this operation, the takedown, looked like a spy movie. They literally sent in helicopters and the police and everything to swoop them up. So yes, so they were here collecting information on basically American life, and you live here, you know what is happening, you know where the divisions are, where the complaints are, what's percolating within civil society, and you know the weaknesses, and then you can compile that information, pass it on, and then Russia has also a better understanding of where to shift their operations. Now with social media, Russia can, at least with these operations, they see them percolating online, and they see, the divisions happening as they're unfolding. But this was one of, the many things. And the reason we're covering this, we have to talk more about one more section that we wrote, also them infiltrating the Republican Party. Again, they've always infiltrated, both political parties. This is an old Soviet tactic, but specifically after 2008, and when they saw this race war percolating in this division, they started focusing on the Republican Party. And there you saw think tanks them infiltrating think tanks, going to events. There was a thing, the Russia House, which literally is the front for Russian intelligence. I mean, they have a Russia House in every in every country in Europe, major city. This literally is a hub for Russian operatives. And again, conveniently placed around either parliaments, or they always place these things in strategic locations. But they had Lubensky, who came here to set up this Russia House, who was targeting Republicans at the time. Dana Rohrabacher was targeted, the FBI in 2012. How you call it? warned him
Dana
that he
Rohrabacher,
was.
sorry to interrupt for people who don't know, Dana Rohrabacher is a former congressman from California. Used to be a very big Russia hawk and then became very strangely a very big Russia file. I mean, Russophile, love Putin. There's a uh, we're not sure who taped this conversation with Kevin McCarthy. I think it was probably Liz Cheney. But there is a very famous recording of Kevin McCarthy, the then speaker, saying, I believe that Putin pays two people, Donald Trump and Dana Rohrabacher. So I just want to interject as to who he is so people understand who you're talking about. But go on.
So the Russia House
Yeah.
basically in DC became an espionage spot. And this was where they literally invited politicians and think tank people and media people, everything they could to infiltrate these circles. So this was another key aspect. So the reason we covered all of this is because, and I will never forgive the media for this, because after Russia attacked our election, the media allowed it to be framed as a partisan issue. Instead of addressing it as a national security issue and an attack on American sovereignty and American elections. Because they allowed this framing, we are here today with Republican House members issuing subpoena to Clinton and Garland and everybody else. Pam Bondi impaneling a called grand jury, for this. But the reason that we, wanted to lay it out, because a lot of people don't understand, and this is the biggest failure of the media. And no matter how many articles I've read from 2016 to present, no one discusses Russia's attack as the bigger picture. And I think it's very important to understand that Russia's attack on 2016 elections did not begin in 2015, that it began in 2008. Once they saw Obama become president, once they saw the racism rising, once they saw this polarization and division, this is when they started to get to work to plan out for the next election. For them, it was, again, they're always monitoring us. This is an old Soviet thing going back to the 50s. They're, 40s, 50s. They've always focused on us. They've always focused on these type of operations to basically weaken America, try to implode America from within. Um, but in this particular case, 2008 was the starting point for the 2016 election. And it should have never been a partisan issue because it wasn't. This was Russia employing different parts of their security services to basically infiltrate the evangelical and indoctrinate and move over the evangelical community, indoctrinate against the Democrats, against the liberals, against Obama, and move it towards Russia's worldview. It was through the NRA, which we're going to do a detailed dive and go through that. It was through, how you call it, the Republican Party when they set up these think tanks. It was through the information collected by the illegals. And this is why we are tying all of this together, that it was the RT, Russia Today outlet being set up. And I'll give you an interesting tidbit. One of the people who runs a communist party now, the communist like organization, um, he in 2012, and it just shows you how Russia operates. In 2012, he was one of the co-founders of Occupy Wall Street. And then he went to work with RT. And since around that time, he had literally been spreading Russian propaganda. He hosted a whole event in Chicago under his communist nonsense, inviting Tara Reid and hanging flags, the ridiculous Russian flags in Russian occupied territory of Ukraine, and having this whole operation. And his organization in overlaps with the African community. Um, who were indicted with working with Russian intelligence for local elections in Florida and Michigan, but also for things that they carried out in the UN, at the UN. So it just shows you that this 2016 election, Russia didn't wake up and say, you know what, we feel like attacking America and just, let's throw whatever we can at it. This was carefully planned, orchestrated, infiltrated. This was close to 1 decade that they made their inroads through every single facet that they could, that would help them. And then, hey, Claude, later on supporting Trump.
So we're going to wrap up, and we strongly urge people to go back and read, if you haven't read our active measure series. The first 2 chapters are out now. We're talking about the second one, 2008 through 2012. The reason we're saying all of this is there were about 100 different ways that the Russians came at this.
Mhm.
But the end result, and the important thing to say, is that Donald Trump was not running in a vacuum. He was running against somebody in 2016. And he was running against one person, and one person who was very, very, very critical to Vladimir Putin, saying that there is no way in hell that I could allow her to win. And that is Hillary Clinton. Because Hillary Clinton, unlike a lot of other people, she did the whole stupid reset button when she first became Secretary of State, to try to reset the relationship. But the reality is she was not a stupid woman, and she's not a stupid woman at all. Understood the threat that Trump faced, would never have allowed, understood the threat that Putin faced, would never have allowed Putin to have these kinds of wars of aggression, and would have been a much bigger hawk than Obama, who, by the way, was completely awful when it came to understanding how Russia was. Mitt Romney was much better, and I say that as a Democrat. Obama was clueless about the threat that Putin posed. I think Obama just wanted to get out of all foreign entanglements, and Russia was a problem he didn't want to deal with. Romney knew better. Hillary knew better. So when people say, well, maybe the Russians interfered, but they didn't do it to help Trump, it's a zero-sum game, my friends. One was going to win and one was going to lose. And Hillary Clinton had to lose. Putin was never going to allow her to win. And if Hillary Clinton lost, that means that the person running against her was going to win. And that person was Donald John Trump. And I want to be very clear about that, because as much as the Republicans now are trying to parse, well, like maybe they interfered, but they didn't interfere to help Trump.
Yeah.
They didn't leak internal information about Trump. They didn't hack the RNC. They didn't hack Trump's personal servers. They did whatever compromise they have on Trump, and I assure you there is a lot. But they did on Hillary, because they could not allow her to win. And so, on that note, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Next week, look for our standalone on Russia and the NRA, because that requires, we're going to throw it into this one. And then we said, this requires a whole separate column. So we're going to be talking about that. For somebody here who said that Butina's English was not good enough to be an illegal, she never pretended to be an illegal. She never pretended to
No.
she never pretended to be American. She was Russian, and she was not part of the illegals program. We're simply saying that Olga said that Anna Chapman, who was part of the illegals program, part of Operation Ghost Stories, might have trained her when she
Yeah,
came here.
no, Anna
Yeah.
Chapman was meant to be, not Anna Chapman.
Maria
Maria
Butina.
Butina was meant to be just, hi, I'm here. I'm interested in guns. Can I be your friend? And, oh, I think I'm going to join university. But she never hid where she's from. She openly admitted that she is Russian. So, yeah, I mean, they have different agents. Not all agents are illegals. Illegals, frankly, is a very, very small program out of the probably tens of thousands of agents Russia is operating and running around the globe. Illegals maybe makes 1% of this. maybe. So this is a very like distinct program, but they have agents everywhere under different versions. We've seen Brazil being a key place where they've been taking Brazilian identities, training people in Brazil, taking their identities and then sending them to Europe or US
Well, they just
under
got
as a Brazilian. So I mean, you have so many different operations when it comes to Russian security services.
all right, I have one request for everybody here, and that is that this is information that needs to get out. And normally when Olga and I do this on Thursdays, I don't put this pitch out, but on this one I will. This is incredibly important information because we are fighting against a fire hose of disinformation coming from our government, and the media is doing nothing, and I mean nothing, to clarify the record. The New York Times, look on their front page. I don't look in the last 20 minutes, but I can tell you there's nothing there to push back on this. This is Olga and I should not be doing this series. The New York Times should be doing the series. The Washington Post, if they still have any good reporters left, which I don't think they do, should be doing the series. The Wall Street Journal should be doing the series. All the news networks should be doing the series. They are not. So we need to get the truth out there because it's super important. Because if we don't, this narrative will be allowed to stand, which is that somehow Barack Obama made up this whole big lie about how the Russians are interfering. And what's that famous phrase, Olga, that the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing people he didn't exist? The greatest trick that Vladimir Putin has ever played is to convince people that he's not doing this. So even though it is happening before our eyes, it's not like Olga and I have any kind of secret intelligence information. It is all there to be put together and collated. You only need to know how to do it, and you only need to know how to read Russian. So, which we both do. So, please get this out. Really get this out to everybody, both the Substack written thing, and if you can get this out either via Substack or it's on my Salty Politics YouTube or however you could get it out, please do, because we need people to know this. If the press is not doing their job, we all need to do it ourselves. Thank you so much. We'll see you back here for Pax Americana at 11 a.m. Eastern on Thursday. We will see you back here again at 12:30 p.m. Eastern next Tuesday for another installment of Active Measures, this one on the NRA and how Maria Butina and others infiltrated the NRA, another pillar of the Republican establishment. And in the meantime, hope you all have a great week, and we will see you all later. Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.